Have you ever felt trapped in anger? Unable to let go of the past no matter how hard you try? What if the key to peace wasn't about changing the world, but about changing the way you see it? This is the story of a man who walked the path of resentment, only to discover that true freedom lies within. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support inspires us to create more meaningful content. Now, let's begin. The city buzzed with life. But inside Anime's mind, a different storm raged. The world saw him as an accomplished man, steady job, decent apartment, a routine that kept life moving forward. Yet, beneath the surface, something gnawed at him. It wasn't exhaustion, nor was it the weight of responsibilities. It was an unsettling emptiness, like a house with all its lights on but no one inside. Every morning, he woke up with the same unshakable thought: is this all there is? The daily cycle of work, interactions, and distractions never filled the void. No matter how much he achieved, the satisfaction never lasted. On paper, his life looked enviable: a respectable corporate job, a reasonable paycheck, a network of colleagues who occasionally laughed at his jokes. He had built a world where everything appeared in order. Yet, something as simple as scrolling through social media or hearing about an old friend's success was enough to stir a deep sense of inadequacy. It wasn't jealousy in the traditional sense. He didn't resent others for their success. Rather, he questioned why he couldn't feel the same joy they seemed to radiate. Why did their accomplishments make him feel so painfully small? A mind at war with itself. Anime had always been introspective, but lately, his thoughts had turned against him. There was an ongoing dialogue in his head, a courtroom where he was both the prosecutor and the accused. You should be grateful for what you have. But is it wrong to want more? You're lucky compared to many people. Then why do I feel so lost? This internal battle spilled into his daily interactions. At work, his patience wore thin. Small inconveniences became unbearable. A misplaced file, an email sent too late, anything could ignite frustration. His colleagues noticed the shift. Conversations with them had become strained. His laughter less frequent. At home, he carried the same restlessness. Conversations with his family were filled with absent-minded nods. He wasn't really listening, just waiting for the moment he could retreat into the quiet of his own thoughts, where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. The breaking point, the unraveling, came on a Wednesday afternoon. It started like any other workday: meetings, emails, the mechanical rhythm of office life. But then, an email arrived from his manager. A sudden request for a performance review. There had been concerns about his attitude, his recent disengagement. Sitting in the conference room, he braced himself. His manager, a woman known for her straightforwardness, didn't soften her words. We've noticed a change in you, she said. Your work is still strong, but your presence is different. You seem angry. The word hit him harder than expected. I'm not angry, he snapped, almost instinctively, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. His manager continued, her tone measured but firm. I don't know what's going on, but if something doesn't change, it's going to affect more than just your work. The meeting ended, but the frustration didn't. He felt exposed, as if someone had pulled back the curtain and revealed the chaos inside him. Walking back to his desk, everything irritated him. The hum of the office lights, the distant chatter, the feeling of being seen in a way he wasn't ready for. When a coworker casually asked if he was okay, he snapped, I'm fine, in a way that made it clear he wasn't. By the time he got home that evening, the storm inside him had grown. The weight of the day pressed on his chest, suffocating. He paced the living room, thoughts swirling like a cyclone. Why does everything feel so wrong? Why can't I just be happy like everyone else? In that restless moment, he turned on the radio. More out of habit than intent. His mind wasn't even registering the voices until. Hatred is never ended by hatred. It is only ended by love. This is the eternal truth. The words came like a thread pulling through the fabric of his mind, stopping him in his tracks. He stared at the radio, unsure whether he had imagined it. The voice continued, quoting an ancient teaching. To respond to hatred with hatred is to trap yourself in suffering. To transform hatred into compassion is the path to freedom. Something inside him shifted, but it wasn't clarity, it was curiosity. A small flicker of recognition. The words felt like an answer to a question he hadn't been able to articulate. But he didn't understand them yet. The city air was heavy that evening. Not from the weather, but from something less tangible. Something pressing down on Anime's chest like an invisible weight. His mind hadn't stopped churning since he heard that unexpected quote on the radio. Hatred is never ended by hatred. It is only ended by love. The words had lingered, hovering in the background of his thoughts like an unresolved melody. But what did they really mean? And why did they stir something deep within him? Restless, he stepped outside, needing movement, needing to escape the suffocating stillness of his apartment. The streets were alive with the usual symphony of honking cars, muffled conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby cafe. He walked without direction, allowing his feet to carry him wherever they pleased. That's when he saw it. A small, dimly lit bookstore tucked between two larger buildings. It wasn't a place he had noticed before, though he had walked this route countless times. Something about it felt different, almost as if it had been waiting for him to find it. On impulse, he stepped inside, the scent of old paper and polished wood wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. The store was quiet, except for the faint rustling of pages and the slow, deliberate movements of an elderly man behind the counter. He looked up, his eyes calm, observant, as if he could see straight through the walls people built around themselves. "You look like someone with too many questions and not enough answers," the man said with a knowing smile. Anime hesitated. He hadn't intended to speak to anyone. But there was something about the old man's presence, unassuming, yet unwavering, that made it impossible to ignore. Anime started, then stopped. What was he even trying to say? That he had heard a line on the radio and now his entire worldview felt shaken? That he was exhausted from carrying anger he didn't know how to put down? The man didn't push. Instead, he simply gestured to a small wooden table near the back of the store. "Sit." A conversation unlike any other. The chair creaked slightly as Anime lowered himself into it. Across from him, the old man poured tea from a pot that looked as aged as the books surrounding them. After a moment of silence, the man asked, "Why are you so angry?" The directness of the question caught Anime off guard. "I'm not," he started, but the words felt hollow even to himself. He sighed. "I don't know." The man tilted his head, unconvinced. Anime ran a hand through his hair. Frustrated. "It's just, people. They lie. They manipulate. They do whatever they want without caring who gets hurt. And the worst part? They never seem to pay for it." His voice had risen slightly, his fingers tightening into a fist on the table. He hadn't meant to spill everything like that, but once he started, it was impossible to stop. "I work hard. I try to do things the right way. And still, it never seems to matter. Meanwhile, people who cheat, who take advantage of others, they get ahead. How is that fair?" The old man listened without interruption. When Anime finally fell silent, he reached for a small candle that sat between them on the table. With practiced ease, he lifted it and held his hand just above the flickering flame. "If you hold a burning coal in your hand," he said calmly, "waiting to throw it at someone who hurt you, who gets burned first?" Anime blinked. The simplicity of the question disarmed him. The old man set the candle back down and leaned forward slightly. Anger isn't the justice you think it is. It only ties you to the very people who harmed you. The more you carry it, the more power you give them over your mind, your peace. Anime wanted to argue. He wanted to say that some things couldn't just be let go, that some wrongs deserved to be repaid. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, he knew the old man was right. How many nights had he lost sleep replaying past conversations, thinking of what he should have said, what he should have done? How many moments had been stolen from him because he was too caught up in resentment to enjoy the present? A question that couldn't be ignored. Anime exhaled slowly, staring down at his hands. But how do you let go? The old man studied him for a long moment before replying. That is something you must discover for yourself. A flicker of frustration rose in Anime's chest. That wasn't the answer he wanted. He wanted a solution, a clear path to follow. So you're saying I just figure it out? The man chuckled, shaking his head. I'm saying that wisdom is not something someone else can give you. You have to walk through it, experience it. Only then will it become real. Anime leaned back in his chair, processing the words. For so long, he had believed that if he could just prove he was right, if he could just make those who wronged him see what they had done, then he would finally feel at peace. But what if he had been looking for peace in the wrong place? He wasn't sure he understood everything yet, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something shift inside him, something that told him this was a question worth exploring. Outside, the city moved as it always did, oblivious to the quiet transformation taking place within him. He didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was clear. He was ready to take the first step. Anime left the bookstore that night with a mind both restless and oddly hopeful. The old man's words had stayed with him, echoing in the quiet corners of his thoughts. If you hold a burning coal, waiting to throw it at someone who hurt you, who gets burned first? It was a question he couldn't shake. He had spent so long believing his anger was justified, that it was a necessary armor against the world's unfairness. But what if it wasn't? What if, instead of protecting him, it had been weighing him down all along? The next morning, as he walked into the office, he made a silent decision. He would try, just once. He would observe himself, as the old man had suggested. If he felt frustration rise, he would pause. He would ask himself, do I want to hold on to this fire? Or can I put it down? At first, it seemed simple enough. During a team meeting, a colleague interrupted him midway through his presentation. Normally, he would have tensed up, his irritation flashing across his face before he could stop it. But this time, he caught himself. He took a slow breath, let the irritation settle, and responded calmly. It was a small thing, but it felt like progress. Throughout the day, he repeated the practice, treating each frustrating moment as an experiment. When someone cut him off in traffic, when an email arrived with an unreasonable request, each time, he reminded himself, this is fire. Do I want to hold it? For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of control over his own emotions. A test he didn't expect. That evening, as he was packing up his things, he heard his manager's voice from across the office. Anime, could I see you for a moment? Something in her tone made his stomach tighten. He followed her to the small glass-walled conference room. She gestured for him to sit, then folded her hands on the table. I wanted to talk about your performance. She began. Your work is excellent, as always, but lately, your attitude has been difficult. The words landed like a slap. He started, but she lifted a hand, stopping him. I don't mean to attack you, she said, but your frustration is noticeable. You've been short with people, and it's affecting team morale. I need you to work on this. A slow, simmering heat began to rise in his chest. He wanted to argue, To defend himself. To explain that he wasn't the problem. Other people were. The ones who didn't pull their weight. The ones who got ahead through office politics instead of hard work. He had been trying so hard to hold himself together. And yet here he was. Being told he was the issue. His fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table. This is fire. Do I want to hold it? For a moment, he almost let it go. Almost. But then, without thinking, the words left his mouth. So I'm the one who needs to change, not the people who actually cause problems? His manager's expression remained calm. I'm saying your reactions are making things harder for you. I'm giving you a chance to fix that before it becomes a bigger issue. Her voice was even, but to him, it felt like another blow. He barely remembered the rest of the conversation. By the time he left the office, his pulse was hammering. His grip on his bag was too tight. His thoughts a chaotic spiral, falling back into old patterns. The anger followed him home. He slammed the door behind him, tossed his bag onto the couch. Every part of him burned with resentment. He had tried. He had spent the entire day making an effort. And for what? To be told he wasn't doing enough? That he was still the problem? He paced the small living room, frustration bubbling over. This is impossible. I can't just sit there and let people walk all over me. Maybe the old man didn't understand. Maybe this kind of thinking only works for people who don't live in reality. The thoughts came fast, harsh, relentless. Then another voice, quieter, surfaced beneath them. Or maybe you just failed. The realization hit him like cold water. He had lost control, just like before. The very thing he had set out to change, he had fallen right back into. The weight of it settled heavily on his chest. He sank onto the couch, rubbing his temples. I'm never going to change. Am I? His hands balled into fists. He had tried, and he had failed. So what was the point? Why not just let himself be angry? Why keep pretending that he could be someone different? For a long time, he sat there, staring at nothing. An unexpected lesson. The next day, still feeling the echoes of his frustration, he kept to himself. He buried himself in work, avoided small talk. Then, just before lunch, something caught his attention. Across the room, one of his coworkers, Daniel, a man in his late 50s, was being reprimanded by a supervisor. The conversation wasn't loud, but it was clear that Daniel was being scolded. Anime watched, expecting to see the same reaction he himself had experienced. A flash of defensiveness. Maybe some frustration. But Daniel simply nodded, listening. There was no anger in his posture. No resistance in his expression. When the supervisor walked away, Daniel simply exhaled, then turned back to his desk. Unfazed, Anime stared. A few minutes later, on impulse, he walked over. Hey, he said, I saw that. You okay? Daniel glanced up, smiling slightly. Yeah, it's fine. Anime hesitated. I would have lost it. Daniel chuckled. Used to. Years ago. But what's the point? You fight. You stress. You let it eat at you. Where does it get you? Anime didn't have an answer for that. Daniel leaned back in his chair. There's an old saying my dad used to tell me. You can't stop the wind from blowing, but you can adjust your sails. Anime nodded slowly, the words sinking in. He had been trying to control everything. The way people treated him. The way the world worked. But maybe control wasn't the answer. Maybe it was about adjusting. As he walked back to his desk, something in his frustration began to loosen, just a little. Anime had spent the past few days trapped in his own mind. The moment with Daniel had stuck with him. The way the older man had taken criticism with such grace. How he had walked away unaffected while Anime had let his frustration consume him. It didn't make sense, or maybe it made too much sense. And that was the problem. He needed answers. That evening, As the sun dipped below the skyline, he found himself back in front of the small bookstore. He hadn't planned on coming, but his feet had carried him there, as if they knew the path before his mind did. Pushing open the door, he was met with the same comforting scent of old paper and warm wood. The old man was at his usual place behind the counter, carefully placing a worn book back onto a shelf. "You're back," the man said, not surprised. Anime hesitated, then sighed. "I failed." The old man set the book down and gestured toward the same table where they had spoken before. "Sit." A question that changed everything. As soon as Anime took his seat, the old man poured tea into 2 small cups, the steam rising lazily between them. He took a sip, then looked at Anime with calm, expectant eyes. "Tell me," he said, "why do you think you're angry?" Anime exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Because people are unfair, they hurt others and don't care. And somehow, I'm the one who's supposed to just let it go." The old man listened without interruption. When Anime finished, he finally spoke. "If another person were in your exact situation, but they didn't feel anger, then what does that mean?" Anime frowned. "It means they don't care as much?" The old man shook his head. "It means that anger isn't in the situation. It's in you." Anime opened his mouth to argue, but no words came. The old man set his teacup down gently. "If someone insults you and you get angry, you think the insult caused your anger. But what if another person hears the same insult and simply laughs? If the words themselves had power, wouldn't they cause the same reaction in everyone?" Anime sat back, processing. "So, you're saying it's not what happens to me, but how I react to it?" The old man nodded. "Exactly. Understanding the nature of suffering." For the first time, Anime began to see his anger in a different light. It wasn't something forced upon him. It was something that arose within him. Something he allowed to take hold. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then, what am I supposed to do with it?" The old man smiled slightly. "That depends. Do you want to be free from it?" The question sent a ripple through him. He had never thought about anger as something he could be free from. He had always assumed it was just there, an automatic response to the world's unfairness. The old man continued, his voice steady. "There are 3 things you must understand. The first is cause and effect. What you feel today is the result of what you have fed your mind in the past. If you have spent years justifying anger, then anger will continue to come easily." Anime nodded slowly. "That made sense." "The second," the old man went on, "is impermanence. Everything changes, including your emotions. Have you ever been furious about something one day, only to barely remember it a week later?" Anime thought back to countless arguments. Moments where he had been convinced he would never forgive someone, only for time to dull the sharp edges of his resentment. "And the third," the old man said, "is non-self. The person you were yesterday is not the person you are today. The person you will be tomorrow has not yet been shaped. You are not fixed. You can change." Anime sat there, letting the words settle. He had spent so long thinking of himself as someone who struggles with anger, as if it were an unchangeable fact. But what if it wasn't? What if he wasn't stuck? Applying the lesson, taking a deep breath, he decided to test this new understanding. Instead of immediately reacting to situations, he would observe his emotions, study them like an outsider watching a storm roll in. That night, as he lay in bed, he went over moments from his past where he had lost his temper. Instead of just remembering the situations, he examined them. What exactly made me angry in that moment? Did my reaction help or hurt me? If I had let go of my anger, would the situation have turned out differently? For the first time, he wasn't just feeling his emotions, he was questioning them. The unexpected challenge. The next day, a piece of news made its way around the office. A colleague, Someone who had undermined anime in the past, taken credit for his work, and spread rumors about him, was in trouble. Something about a mistake in a report that had made it up to upper management. Anime heard whispers of it in the break room, saw the way people exchanged knowing looks, and then he felt it, a small, quiet satisfaction rising in his chest. He didn't say anything, but the feeling was there, and that's when it hit him. He was enjoying this, not in a loud, vengeful way, but in the subtle, self-satisfied way of someone watching karma unfold. And the realization made him feel sick. He had told himself he wanted to let go of resentment, but deep down, had he really changed? Or had he simply been waiting for the world to punish those who had wronged him? Was he truly free from anger? Or had he just buried it beneath a mask of self-righteousness? Standing there, the old man's words returned to him. If another person were in your situation, but they did not feel anger, then where does the anger truly come from? He had thought he was making progress. But maybe, just maybe, his journey was only beginning. The weight of realization sat heavily on Anime's chest. He had thought he was making progress, that he was learning to let go of his anger. But when he felt that flicker of satisfaction upon hearing about his colleague's troubles, it unsettled him. It wasn't loud or vengeful. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and that was enough to shake him. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts twisted in on themselves, unraveling every effort he had made. I've been trying so hard to let go. So why did I feel that? Am I still the same person deep down? The doubt crept in like a shadow stretching across his mind. If even after all this effort he still harbored resentment, then what was the point? Was change even possible? He felt like he was standing at a crossroads. One path led toward transformation, slow, uncertain, demanding patience. The other led back to where he had always been, familiar, comfortable, but heavy with the weight of anger. For the first time, he wasn't sure which one he would take. Seeking guidance once more, the next afternoon, he found himself back at the bookstore. It had become his quiet refuge, the one place where the noise in his head seemed to soften. The old man was there, as always, organizing books with the same slow, deliberate movements. He glanced up when Anime entered, but said nothing. Anime hesitated, then walked over. I need to ask you something. The old man nodded toward their usual table. Then sit. They settled into the familiar space, the scent of old paper and tea wrapping around them like a familiar comfort. I thought I was getting better, Anime said, frustration threading through his voice. I've been trying to let go of my anger. But when I heard that someone who hurt me was struggling, I felt happy about it. I didn't say anything. I didn't act on it. But I felt it. The old man poured tea, then placed a cup in front of him. And that bothers you? Anime frowned. Of course, it does. Doesn't that mean I haven't really changed? The old man studied him for a long moment, then spoke. There is an old story, he said. Would you like to hear it? The story of two wolves. A grandfather once sat with his grandson by a fire. The old man began. The boy was troubled, much like you. He told his grandfather that he felt like there were two voices battling inside of him. One voice was full of anger, resentment, jealousy, and fear. It whispered that he should hold on to his grudges, that he was right to hate those who wronged him. But the other voice was different. It spoke with kindness, patience, and understanding. It told him that forgiveness would free him, that love was stronger than hate. The boy asked his grandfather, which one will win? The old man paused, letting the question linger. Anime already knew the answer before it came. The one you feed, the old man said simply. For a moment, Anime didn't speak. He turned the words over in his mind, feeling the weight of their meaning settle into place. So tell me, the old man continued, looking at him with quiet curiosity. Which one have you been feeding? Recognizing the pattern, Anime swallowed hard. He wanted to say he had been feeding the second wolf, the one that sought peace. After all, he had been trying to change. But if he was honest with himself, had he really let go of the first one? How many times had he replayed past wrongs in his head? How many times had he secretly wished for those who hurt him to understand his pain by experiencing it themselves? I thought I was doing better, he admitted, voice quieter now, but I guess I've still been feeding the wrong one. The old man nodded, but there was no judgment in his gaze, only understanding. It's not about never feeling anger, he said, it's about recognizing when it arises and choosing not to nourish it. You didn't act on your resentment. That means you were already changing. Anime looked down at his tea, watching the way the steam curled into the air. Then why does it feel like I'm failing? Because transformation is not immediate. The habits of the mind are like rivers. The more you have traveled a certain path, the deeper the groove it carves. Even when you start digging a new path, the old one still exists. It takes time before the water stops flowing there. For a long time, Anime didn't respond. He simply let the words sink in. Maybe he had been expecting change to feel sudden, like flipping a switch, but that wasn't how it worked. Was it? It was a slow, deliberate shift, one that required constant effort. He exhaled, feeling some of the tension in his chest release. So what do I do? The old man smiled slightly. You keep feeding the right wolf. A test of patience. That evening, Anime walked home with a different kind of awareness. He didn't expect to wake up the next morning free of resentment. But he would watch it. He would see when it arose. And he would decide, moment by moment, which wolf to feed. But life has a way of testing new lessons. The test came sooner than he expected. The next day, as he sat at his desk, he heard a voice that made his stomach tighten. Hey, long time no see. He turned, and there he was. One of the people who had wronged him in the past. A former colleague who had once spread rumors about him, twisting words and turning people against him. Someone Anime had worked hard to forget. And now, this person stood there, acting as if nothing had happened. A rush of emotion surged inside him. The same familiar heat, the same tightening in his chest. His body remembered the old anger before his mind even had a chance to intervene. He could feel the choice forming, as clear as the story the old man had told him. Which wolf would he feed? His jaw tightened, his hands clenching slightly under the desk. The urge to say something sharp, to remind this person of what they had done, was strong. But then, he took a breath. For a moment, he didn't react. He simply observed the anger instead of letting it take over. And in that space of awareness, something shifted. He didn't feel the need to be overly friendly. He didn't have to pretend to be unaffected. But he also didn't have to let himself drown in the past. He nodded, offering a neutral, calm response. The conversation was short. The person moved on. But Anime sat there, realizing something profound. For the first time, he had seen his anger rise without letting it consume him. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first real step toward freedom. Anime sat on the edge of his bed, the dim glow of the bedside lamp casting soft shadows along the walls. His mind was quieter than usual, but the remnants of the day still clung to him. The tension in his shoulders, the flickers of frustration, the unspoken words he had swallowed when confronted by someone he once resented. He had held back his usual reaction, but that didn't mean the anger hadn't been there. It had stirred beneath the surface, waiting for permission to rise. And that was the part that troubled him. Even as he made progress, the emotions still came. He remembered the old man's words from the bookstore. Don't fight your emotions, just watch them, as if you were sitting by a river, watching the water flow past. It sounded simple, Yet the idea of not engaging with his emotions felt unnatural. He had always assumed that to control something, he had to push against it, suppress it. But what if control wasn't about force? Taking a slow breath, he closed his eyes. For the first time, he didn't try to silence his mind. He just let it be. Thoughts drifted in. Memories from the day. Old grievances. The faint sting of a past argument. Instead of reacting to them, he imagined himself sitting by a riverbank, watching them float downstream. Some were small ripples, barely noticeable. Others were like waves crashing against the shore, demanding his attention. But no matter their size, they all passed. And slowly, he felt something shift, seeing anger for what it is. As he continued the practice over the next few days, something strange happened. The emotions still came, but they felt different, lighter, less permanent. One afternoon, as he was making coffee, he thought about an old friend who had betrayed his trust years ago. In the past, just the thought of that person would have sparked a surge of resentment. But now, it was as if the memory had lost its sharp edges. It wasn't that the hurt had disappeared. It was still there, but it wasn't consuming him. He realized something important then. Anger didn't last forever. It came and went, like a breeze passing through an open window. The only reason it stayed was because he kept holding onto it, replaying old wounds, feeding the fire. Now, when anger arose, he didn't fight it. He didn't try to shove it away. He simply noticed it, and more often than not, it faded faster than he expected. A real test. But theory and reality were two different things. And the world had a way of testing lessons learned too quickly. One morning at work, as he was reviewing a report, he overheard two coworkers talking near the break room. His name came up in the conversation. At first, he wasn't paying attention, but then, he caught the tone. Low, dismissive, almost amused. That guy? He acts like he's got everything figured out now. One of them muttered, like he's suddenly some enlightened monk or something. Anime's hands tightened around his coffee cup. A familiar heat rose in his chest. The instinct to walk over, to set them straight, flared up almost immediately. He had worked so hard to change, and now he was being mocked for it? But then, just as quickly, another voice surfaced in his mind. Watch it. He took a breath. Instead of reacting, he simply observed what was happening inside him. Anger, defensiveness, the urge to prove himself. He let those feelings rise. And then, he watched them go. By the time he finished his coffee, the emotions had already begun to fade. And to his surprise, he felt free. A bigger challenge. Later that evening, Anime walked home, feeling lighter than he had in a long time. But peace never lasted forever. His phone buzzed. A message from his sister. Call me when you can. It's about Dad. His heart tightened. He hadn't spoken to his father in over a year. The relationship had always been strained, but their last argument had turned it into silence. For a long moment, he just stared at the screen. He knew he had a choice. He could react the way he always had, carrying old wounds, keeping his distance, letting pride dictate his actions. Or he could take everything he had been learning and face the situation differently. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the call button. Anime had replayed the conversation with his father in his mind for days. It had been tense, brief, full of unspoken words. His father's voice had been unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because it had been so long since he had heard it. There had been no apology, no reconciliation, just facts. Short sentences exchanged like transactions. His father had been in the hospital. He was recovering. That was all. And yet, something had been different this time. Anime hadn't lashed out. He hadn't let the bitterness rise and take control. He had listened. For the first time, He had chosen not to let his emotions dictate his response. And now, he would be tested again. A challenge he didn't expect. It was a normal afternoon at work. The kind where hours dragged and emails piled up faster than they could be answered. Anime had just stepped away for a break when he overheard two coworkers talking in hushed voices. His name came up. I don't know why the boss still trusts him with these projects. One of them muttered, last time, he almost messed up that report. Remember? Anime's stomach tightened. That wasn't true. The mistake they were referring to hadn't even been his. The familiar heat of frustration flared in his chest. His hands curled slightly at his sides. His first instinct was to walk over, to confront them, to set the record straight. But then, something shifted. Instead of reacting, he caught himself. This is the fire. Do I want to hold it? The old thought returned, calm and steady. Taking a breath, he stepped back. He let the initial rush of anger rise and fall, observing it rather than acting on it. And then, just like that, it was gone, choosing a different response. Later that day, one of the coworkers, Mark, the one who had spoken against him, approached his desk. Hey, I sent you an email earlier, Mark said, his tone casual, as if nothing had happened. Did you get a chance to review it? The old anime would have responded sharply, using the moment to make a point, to let Mark know he had heard everything. But this time, he simply nodded. Yeah, I saw it. I'll get back to you soon. Mark seemed almost caught off guard by the neutral tone. Cool, thanks. As he walked away, Anime felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because he had avoided confrontation, but because, for the first time, he had chosen his reaction instead of being controlled by it. The power of stillness. That evening, as he walked home, he thought back to what had happened. Nothing external had changed. Mark had still spoken behind his back. The office gossip still existed. But he had changed. For the first time, he truly understood that peace wasn't about controlling the world around him. It was about learning to control himself. He didn't need to win every argument. He didn't need to make sure people saw him the way he wanted to be seen. He only needed to be at peace with himself. And for the first time in a long time, he was. A new trial, just as he was beginning to feel like he had turned a corner. Life had other plans. That night, his phone rang. It was his sister again. Dad's condition got worse, she said, her voice strained. They want us to come in. Anime's breath caught. He wasn't ready. He had barely started entangling his feelings about his father. Now, he was being pulled back into the center of it all. The old anger stirred again, mixed with something deeper. Fear. He had a choice. Go and face everything he had been running from, or let the past keep him away. Anime stood outside the hospital, gripping his phone tightly. The last message from his sister still lingered on the screen. Dad's condition got worse. They want us to come in. The city moved around him. Indifferent. People walked past, caught up in their own lives, their own worries. But for him, the world had suddenly narrowed down to a single moment. A decision he had been avoiding for too long. He had spent years carrying the weight of resentment toward his father. Walking through those hospital doors would mean facing everything, his past, his anger, his regret, and he wasn't sure he was ready. But some things didn't wait for readiness. Taking a slow breath, he stepped inside. The breaking point. The air inside the hospital was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and something heavier. Grief. Uncertainty. His sister was already there, sitting in the waiting area, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked up when he approached. You came. He nodded. How is he? She exhaled. Stable, for now, but the doctors said it was close. A nurse passed by, pushing a cart of medical supplies. The soft beep of heart monitors echoed from down the hall. Anime felt the weight of it all pressing in on him. For years, he had let the distance between him and his father grow. Brick by brick. Now, standing on the other side of it, he wasn't sure how to break through. And then, as if the universe wasn't done testing him, his sister's expression shifted. "By the way," she said, her voice careful, "he asked for you." Anime's chest tightened. "Why?" She shrugged. "Maybe he's ready to talk. Or maybe," a part of him whispered, "he just wants to say goodbye." An internal battle. As he walked toward his father's room, a war raged inside him. "I've tried to change. I've tried to let go of the past. But how am I supposed to stay calm when everything is falling apart? What if it's too late? What if he doesn't even care?" The moment he stepped through the doorway, all his questions vanished. His father looked smaller than he remembered. The man who had once seemed unshakable now lay in a hospital bed. His face pale, his body weakened by time and illness. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, his father's eyes flickered open. "You came," he said, his voice rough but steady. Something in Anime's chest twisted. "Yeah," he managed. His father studied him. "You look different." Anime let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. "So do you." A silence stretched between them, filled with everything they had never said. The past felt like a wall between them, built of old wounds and words left unspoken. His father finally sighed. "I know I wasn't what you needed me to be." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was more than Anime had expected. Seeking guidance. Later that night, after leaving the hospital, he found himself walking toward the bookstore. The lights inside were still on, casting a warm glow through the windows. The old man looked up when Anime entered, as if he had been expecting him. "I need to understand something," Anime said, taking a seat. The old man nodded. "Go on." Anime leaned forward, hands clasped. "I've been trying. I've been working on controlling my emotions, letting go of my anger. But now, just when I think I've changed, life throws this at me. My father." He hesitated, exhaling sharply. "How am I supposed to stay calm when this feels so unfair?" The old man was quiet for a moment, then said, "Did you believe this path would make suffering disappear?" Anime frowned. "No, but I thought it would help me handle it." The old man met his gaze. "And hasn't it?" Anime opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. "Hadn't it?" Yes. The emotions were still there. The anger, the grief, the uncertainty. But this time, they weren't controlling him. He had faced his father without letting rage dictate his actions. He had stepped into the hospital, sat by that bed, and listened. The old man continued. "Walking this path does not mean avoiding pain. It means learning to sit with it without letting it consume you." Anime looked down, turning the words over in his mind. "All this time," he murmured, "I thought I was being tested. That maybe I hadn't changed enough." The old man shook his head. "This isn't a punishment. It's a mirror. Life is showing you how far you've come, and how much further there is to go." A moment of clarity. For the first time since getting the call from his sister, something inside him settled. Pain was part of life. Loss was inevitable. He couldn't control those things. But he could control how he met them. He could choose whether to let them break him, or shape him. The final test. Just as he was beginning to grasp this, the door of the bookstore creaked open. A man stepped inside, and Anime's breath caught. It was someone from his past. Someone who had betrayed him, hurt him in ways that had taken years to untangle. And now, this person was standing there, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. The old wounds stirred. The emotions threatened to rise. This was it, the moment that would show him if he had truly changed. The bookstore felt smaller somehow. Or maybe it was just the presence of the man standing at the entrance, the one person Anime never expected to see again. Time had passed. But the memory of their last encounter remained sharp. This was someone who had wronged him, betrayed his trust, turned his kindness into something disposable. And now, as if nothing had ever happened, the man stood before him, hesitation flickering across his face. Anime's body tensed before his mind even had a chance to catch up. The instinct to react, to let his anger rise, to say something cutting, was immediate. This was a moment that, in the past, would have ignited everything inside him. But now, something was different. The battle within, a storm brewed inside him. Two forces pulling in opposite directions. One voice whispered of old wounds, of justice, of all the things he had wanted to say if he ever got the chance. You should let him know exactly how much damage he caused. People like him don't change. If you let this go, you're letting him win. But another voice, quieter but firm, reminded him of something else. What you choose in this moment will define who you become. He thought back to the lesson of the two wolves, the one fed by resentment, the other by understanding. For so long, he had let his anger dictate his reactions. But he had seen where that road led. He took a breath, steadying himself. This was his choice now. Breaking the pattern. The man shifted awkwardly, clearly unsure of what to say. Hey, he started, his voice tentative. Anime could see it. The expectation in his eyes. He was waiting for an outburst, for accusations, for a scene. But instead, Anime remained still. He didn't force a smile, didn't pretend, he simply observed. It wasn't easy. His pulse still raced, his mind still flickered with memories of the past. But he didn't react. The silence stretched between them. And slowly, the man's posture changed. The confidence he had walked in with faded, replaced by something else. Shame. I know I don't deserve to ask for this, the man said, his gaze dropping. But, I wanted to apologize. Anime's breath caught. He hadn't expected that. For so long, he had imagined this moment playing out in different ways. But in every version, he was the one who would deliver the final blow, through words, through rejection, through proving that he had moved on without needing closure. But now, standing in front of the man who had once hurt him, he realized something. He didn't need revenge. He didn't even need an apology. What he needed was to be free. Choosing peace. He studied the man for a long moment, then simply nodded. I hope you've changed, Anime said finally. Not bitter, not warm, just honest. The man exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. I have, he said, at least, I'm trying to. With that, he gave a small nod and turned to leave. Anime watched him go, feeling lighter. Not because the past had been erased, not because everything was suddenly healed, but because, for the first time, he had let go. The realization. Later that night, sitting in his apartment, Anime reflected on what had happened. Forgiveness had always seemed like something he had to give to someone else. But now, he understood. It wasn't about the other person at all. It was about letting go of the weight he had been carrying. He had spent years believing that his anger was necessary, that it kept him strong, that it protected him from being hurt again. But in reality, it had been a prison. And tonight, for the first time, he had stepped outside of it. A final test awaits. Just as the realization settled, his phone buzzed. It was his sister. His father's condition had worsened. The doctors weren't sure how much time was left. Another test, another choice. Was he ready? Anime sat by the hospital window, watching the soft glow of the streetlights below. His father was sleeping, his breathing steady but fragile. The machines next to him hummed quietly, marking the passage of time in slow, rhythmic beeps. Something had shifted, not just in the room, not just in his father's condition, but in him. He had spent so many years carrying resentment, convinced that if he let it go, he would lose something. his sense of justice, his identity, the protection his anger had given him. But now, he saw it for what it was. A burden, a weight he had carried long after it had stopped serving him. For the first time in his life, he felt what it was like to be free. Seeing the mind clearly, he thought back to every moment that had led him here, the struggles, the setbacks, the times he had failed to control his emotions. And yet, each of those moments had been necessary. He had believed that peace was something external, something to be found in circumstances, in achievements, in the way people treated him. But it had never been about that. It had always been about the way he met life. Pain was inevitable. Suffering, however, was optional. For the first time, he truly understood what the old man at the bookstore had been trying to teach him. Nothing outside of him had changed. His father was still sick. The past was still the past. The world would continue to be unpredictable. But his mind was no longer at war with itself. Experiencing true peace. That night, as he sat in silence, something unexpected happened. He felt peace, not the fleeting kind that came from distractions or temporary relief. This was different. It was a peace that didn't depend on anything. Not on people, not on circumstances, not even on his own emotions. It was the kind of peace that came from knowing that no matter what happened, he had the strength to face it. And that was enough. A question that remained. The next day, he found himself once again at the bookstore. The old man was there, as always, placing a book back on the shelf with careful precision. "You look different," the old man said as Anime took a seat. Anime exhaled. "I feel different." The old man nodded. "Tell me." Anime hesitated, then said, "I think I finally understand. I've spent my whole life trying to control everything, other people, my past, my emotions. But peace doesn't come from control. It comes from letting go." The old man smiled. "Yes, but now that I know this," Anime continued, "how do I hold on to it? How do I make sure I don't lose this peace?" The old man chuckled, pouring them both a cup of tea. "You don't." Anime frowned. "What do you mean?" "Nothing is permanent," the old man said, "not even peace. You will lose it. You will struggle again. You will forget. But if you continue to observe your mind, you will always find your way back." Anime sat with those words, letting them sink in. He had been looking for a final answer, a way to secure peace forever. But that wasn't how life worked. And that was okay. A new beginning. As he left the bookstore, something unexpected happened. A coworker, one who had once been distant, even hostile, approached him on the street. "You seem different," they said, studying him carefully, "like something's changed." Anime smiled. "It has." The air was crisp as Anime walked through the city streets, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The weight he had carried for so long, the resentment, the anger, the endless need for control, had loosened its grip on him. He wasn't perfect. He still had moments of frustration, still felt the stirrings of old habits. But now, he saw them for what they were. Passing clouds, not permanent storms. It was a quiet kind of freedom. He had spent so much time trying to change himself, thinking that peace was something he had to earn, something just out of reach. But now, he realized it had never been about becoming someone different. It had always been about seeing clearly. Suffering wasn't something that life inflicted upon him. It was something his mind created when it clung to things that were already gone. And now, for the first time, he understood that letting go wasn't the same as giving up. It was simply making space for something better. A familiar struggle in someone else. Later that afternoon, Anime sat at a small cafe, sipping tea and enjoying the quiet hum of conversation around him. He hadn't planned to meet anyone. But then he saw an old friend approaching, someone he hadn't spoken to in a long time. The friend looked exhausted, shoulders slumped, a tension in his face that Anime recognized all too well. Without waiting for an invitation, the friend sat down across from him with a heavy sigh. I don't get it, the friend said, rubbing his temples. I did everything right, I worked hard, I stayed loyal, and still, life keeps knocking me down. Anime set his cup down. Listening. The friend exhaled sharply. I just don't understand how you do it. You used to get just as frustrated as me, probably more. But now, you just seem different. There was something vulnerable in his voice, a quiet plea beneath the frustration. How do you stay calm? He asked. How do you stop caring about all the unfair things in the world? Anime smiled slightly. I never stopped caring. I just stopped letting it consume me. The friend frowned. How? Anime hesitated. He wasn't a teacher, not like the old man at the bookstore. He didn't have perfect answers. But then, he remembered what had changed everything for him. He didn't need to explain everything. He just needed to plant a seed. Becoming the guide. He looked at his friend carefully. Tell me something, he said. If two people are caught in the same storm, but one of them stays dry while the other gets soaked, what does that mean? The friend blinked. It means one of them had an umbrella. I guess. Anime nodded. And the storm? The friend hesitated. It's the same for both of them. Anime leaned back, letting the words sink in. So maybe it's not the storm that decides how we feel. Maybe it's what we carry with us. The friend stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. A flicker of understanding. But understanding wasn't the same as transformation. Anime knew that better than anyone. The endless path. Later that evening, as he left the cafe, Anime found himself walking toward the bookstore. He hadn't planned to go, but something pulled him there. The old man was exactly where he always was, placing a book back on the shelf with steady hands. You're back, the old man said without turning around. Anime smiled. I think I accidentally became a teacher today. The old man chuckled. Did you? Anime nodded. Someone came to me for advice. I didn't think I had the answers. But then, I remembered what you told me. And suddenly, I knew what to say. The old man finally turned, his gaze calm. And what did you tell them? That I didn't change the world. Anime said, I just changed how I saw it. The old man studied him for a long moment, then nodded approvingly. Then you're beginning to understand. Anime exhaled, feeling a sense of quiet certainty settle within him. But then, the old man's expression shifted. A flicker of something unreadable passed across his face. You've come far, he said, but don't mistake this for the end of the journey. Anime frowned. What do you mean? The old man's voice was gentle, but firm. Life will test you again, he said. There will be moments when the storm returns, and you will wonder if you have truly changed. Those moments are not signs of failure. They are invitations to go deeper. A quiet chill ran down Anime's spine. Because deep down, he knew the old man was right. He had found peace, but could he hold onto it when the next storm arrived? The morning air was crisp as Anime stepped outside, the warmth of the rising sun brushing against his skin. He stood still for a moment, watching the way the light touched the buildings, how the city slowly stirred to life. Everything looked the same, the streets, the people, the sounds of daily routine. And yet, everything felt different. He had spent so long searching for something. Peace, happiness, meaning. Believing it was something to be found out there. But now, after all the lessons, all the struggles, he finally understood. It had never been about the world changing. It had always been about him. A final visit to the teacher. Later that afternoon, he found himself once again at the bookstore. The old man was there, as he always was, arranging books with the same careful attention, as if each title held a secret worth preserving. Without a word, Anime walked to the counter and stood there, waiting. The old man glanced up, his eyes twinkling with quiet amusement. I was wondering when you'd come back. Anime exhaled. I wanted to thank you. The old man nodded. And? Anime hesitated. And to ask one last thing. The old man gestured for him to continue. Have I truly changed? The old man smiled. Do you still need me to answer that for you? Anime thought for a moment, then shook his head. No. A pause. Then you have changed. The response was simple, but it carried a weight that settled deep within him. For a long time, he had believed there was some final point he needed to reach. Some ultimate state of peace that would mark the end of his struggles. But now, standing here, he realized the truth. There was no finish line. There never had been. The journey itself was the point. The road ahead. As he walked out of the bookstore, a light breeze passed through the street, rustling the pages of an open book left on a cafe table. He had no way of knowing what the future held. There would still be moments of frustration, moments of sadness, moments of doubt, but now, he knew that none of those things defined him. He was not his anger. He was not his pain. He was not the past. He was simply here, walking forward, open to whatever came next. And for the first time, that was enough. A final thought, a quote appeared in his mind. Something the old man had said once. Something that had only now fully settled in his heart. Happiness is not a destination. It is how we walk the path. With a quiet smile, Anime took another step forward. True peace isn't about avoiding pain or controlling everything around us. It's about learning to let go and face life with a steady heart. Anime's journey showed us that happiness isn't found in the past or the future, but in how we choose to walk each moment. What about you? Have you ever struggled with letting go of anger or resentment? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Buddhism Anime so you won't miss our next journey of wisdom and transformation. See you in the next video.